Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time you're watching this, your own end or print hand are, since we're in Wales and Cardiff. So, absolutely delighted to welcome Michelle Gildernew with us, the Sinn Féin representative today. And what we'll be looking at is politics in and about the north of Ireland since 1998. And we'll have a little bit about the bit before as well, and an introduction I'll do. And this is part of two events, and there'll be two separate videos you'll see for this today, and there'll be an evening discussion where we'll be joined by Professor John Tong and others as well to look further into this topic. Just in terms of introductions today, so Michelle Gildernew, absolutely delighted you can join us. So Michelle is from County Tyrone and is a Sinn Féin politician. Comes from a large Republican family, and her parents were instrumental in the squatting and subsequent eviction in Caledon in 1968. Michelle was the Sinn Féin representative in London in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and was elected to the Assembly in 1998. And she stood in the Westminster election in 2001, winning Bobby Sands' seat on the 20th anniversary of his death. As an MLA, she held various senior positions on Assembly committees and was Agriculture and Rural Development Minister from 2007 to 2011, during which time she focused heavily on anti-poverty measures in rural communities, including making provision for enhanced rural childcare, broadband, and rural transport. And then myself, so I'm Dr Thomas Leahy. I'm a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics and contemporary history here at Cardiff University. My primary research area is the conflict in and about the north of Ireland, peace process and politics there. More specifically, I research on Irish Republicanism since 1969. My first book, Intelligence War Against the IRA, with Cambridge Uni Press, won the Political Studies Association of Ireland's Brian Farrell Book Prize in 2021. Just for anyone new to this topic and keen to get an interest in different insights, I thought I'd just give a quick brief overview of the conflict, peace process and politics in the north of Ireland, which then is a nice kind of starting point for 1998. So the conflict commences in 1969. Irish Republicans saw the undemocratic nature of partition by the British government and Ulster Unionist British Protestants in Northern Ireland from 1920 and even further back in Irish history as the long-term catalyst. Scholars generally agree that the devolved British Protestant Ulster Unionist government in Belfast, or Stormont as it's also known, thereafter implemented widespread discrimination against the Northern Nationalist or the Irish Catholic community in Northern Ireland before 1969. A civil rights movement then emerged in the 1960s but was met with Unionist resistance. Intercommunal clashes emerged by 1969, leading to British troops entering. However, in my own personal view, they quickly turned on the Irish nationalist community to try and prevent a two-front conflict. By 1972, some indiscriminate British security operations saw a sizable minority of Irish Catholics join the new Irish Republican Army, which we'll just refer to as the IRA from here on. The IRA and its political wing, Sinn Féin, believed that steps towards Irish unity was the best way to achieve equality in the north. A peace process then emerged, inclusive of all sides, by the 1990s, due, in my view, to a political and armed stalemate. By 1998, the major parties to the conflict, other than the Democratic Unionist Party, signed the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement. That implemented power sharing, started police reform, prisoner releases, and much more. In politics today, you have five main parties, just to give you a quick overview. Some of them I'm sure will be mentioned today. Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican All-Ireland Party, who seek Irish unification. For unionism, you've got the Democratic Unionist Party and then the Ulster Unionist Party, so we'll refer to them as most likely the DUP and UUP, who want to keep Northern Ireland British. There are some differences between the parties, which we'll touch on partly in the session, I'm sure, primarily later. Then there's what you call the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, who want Irish unification, but my own view would be in the more medium to longer term than Sinn Féin. And then there's the Alliance Party, a liberal, non-unionist, non-nationalist party who claim to be agnostic on the Irish unity question. So what we'll do is go through a series of questions and get Michelle's insights, and I'll contribute some thoughts as and when as well. So Michelle, you're very welcome to Cardiff to begin with. Our first question is, if we start with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, could you comment on how Irish Republicans viewed it at the time?
Okay, well, first of all, Thomas, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. You have a beautiful city and a beautiful university. So I'm not great at Irish. I'm worse again at Welsh, so I'm not even going to try and attempt a wee bit. But it was one of the things that Every time I get to Wales, I just love how you embrace your language, and I notice the differences, and certainly the legislative differences in that and Irish in the north of Ireland. So anyway, your question. I suppose the Good Friday Agreement was a culmination of years and years of hard work. Obviously, we had come through the civil rights campaign in the late 60s, early 70s. We'd come through the conflict, as you said, the British Army coming over. We had some very turbulent years. We had the hunger strikes in 1981, which was probably the most defining moment of my life. We went through then the 80s, the 90s. I travelled a bit and saw what the world was like in Australia and America and places like that. And I was actually in Australia when the peace process, when the first area ceasefire was called. So I came home with a lot of optimism and confidence that things were going to be different. And I wasn't home 2 days until the first British Army raid happened on our house. So I decided at that stage, I'd always been a Republican, I'd always been active around election times. I decided at that stage that I needed to get involved and do more. So as a result, I'd run for election twice before the 1988 elections to the Good Friday Agreement. I was elected then successfully the third time as an Assembly member, a member of the Legislative Assembly in Belfast in 1988. But in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, when I was doing my job in London, I was briefing the Conservatives, the one or two Conservatives, mostly Labour Party MPs, some Lib Dems, and keeping them abreast of what was happening as things were changing in the north. So as a result, on the day of the Good Friday Agreement being signed, I was in London at that point. A few weeks later, the Omagh bomb happened, the biggest single tragedy in the north, and I came home shortly after that. And I think when we were in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, we had worked very hard to bring our constituents with us, and we had done lots of briefings and lots of meetings and spoken to people in big rooms and small rooms. When the Good Friday Agreement then was finalised, it was never signed. People sort of think that it was signed and there was an agreement and all the rest of it. We couldn't get some of the unionist parties to go in and do a signing ceremony, but we went out, took the Good Friday Agreement and went on the road. Now, it was sent to every single home in the north of Ireland, which was very significant because people then had the chance to read it, not just to be reading sound bites or to be listening to the media, some of whom could be very negative in the north and everywhere. But everybody got a copy of the agreement. They were able to read it in their own homes, and we went on the road. We had worked very closely with the African National Congress, so the ANC came over to Ireland to do meetings. They went into the prisons, they met prisoners, they went to big meetings with 400 people in the room, they went to little meetings with 4 people around a kitchen table. But we talked and talked and talked, and I remember Mitchell McLaughlin saying at a meeting in Toonbridge at County Antrim, read the Good Friday Agreement, read it again and again. He said, this is not a Republican document, this is a template for us to move forward. Don't expect it to be a Republican document. There's not everything in there that we would want, but there's enough in there that we can work with it and we can build on it. And I think one commentator said at the time that when the ink was drying on the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin went on the road and the unionist parties went to bed. And, you know, we went out and sold it. We knew that this on its own couldn't achieve peace, that we had to work towards it and we had to build on what we had achieved so far. But it was a hard road, and I think fundamentally that was the difference between our attitude to the Good Friday Agreement. We didn't love it. There was lots in there that we didn't like at all, but we knew there had to be a compromise, and we knew that there was enough there that we could work with. Unfortunately, the other parties to the Good Friday Agreement didn't take the same view. Now, the SDLP, that you've mentioned already, was obviously in favour of it. The Alliance Party were in favour. The UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, were the lead party in the north at the time. They were most in favour out of the unionist parties. The Democratic Unionist Party walked out of the process. So it was the UUP that we were negotiating with. The SDLP, interestingly, was the biggest party at that time. And when we eventually got around to putting the first and deputy first ministers in situ, It was David Trimble was the First Minister, and Seamus Mallon from the Social Democratic and Labour Party was the Deputy First Minister. So there was a 10-person executive, and we had 2 ministers on that executive. So it was, I think the question you asked was, how did Republicans react to it? That's what we did. We went out, we took what was there, and we went out and sold it to our people. We brought our people with us. And as a result, I think our community was a lot more settled about the Good Friday Agreement, what was in there and what their future looked like as a result of that.
Yeah, interesting. I think, like, my own thoughts, I think coming out of the conflict that, Irish Republicans, particularly the leadership, would have seen this as the situation was in a stalemate. I think Gerry Adams mentioned those words in the 1980s. There's an armed and political stalemate. And I think on that respect, like you said, I definitely echo that they saw things that were positive in the agreement. And this was kind of the maximum on offer at that stage that you could work with. I think, certainly my own view in that respect for Republicans, like in some academic work, there's therefore discussion, well, therefore, is this a failure for Republicans? They have to accept the compromise. My view is that that's not the case. I think the leadership actually, and certainly one of my colleagues, Neil O'Doherty, can trace this back to the 1970s and say, Republican leadership, they have slightly different ideas, but they were always willing to have talks to try and end the conflict. So I think in that sense, a really key part of that we see is the idea of self-determination. That's absolutely fundamental, and that had to be conceded publicly by the British government in some forms that could be held to it. And we see that with, 1993, the Downing Street Declaration says, there can be self-determination, same time, North and South, separately but concurrently on the island of Ireland. And I think that's a really important moment. And, Gerry Adams, again, would recognise that within his memoirs, mentioning is, it's not exactly what Republicans want because it's not as a single unit, it's 2 separate units. But nonetheless, it is the first time publicly the British government is saying it's not our business to decide what happens north and south of the border. I think there's other concessions as well that Republicans are able to manage to achieve in terms of power sharing inclusive of Sinn Féin, the North-South Ministerial Council. I mean, this was something it used to be called the Council of Ireland in the early 70s, was something called the Sunningdale Agreement, and unions were against that at that point. There was a general strike. And that brought down that agreement because of the Council of Ireland, ostensibly said possibly because of power sharing as well, in my view. Political pathway towards unity, RUC reformed into PSNI, prisons released. Now, at the same time, yes, there was a minority within the Irish Republican community who disagree with the peace settlement. Some of them would be what we could term dissenters, so people who politically disagreed with it but didn't agree with the IRA's campaign being resurrected or continuing. And then you've got what, colloquially in the media is known as dissident Republicans, people who continue to use armed methods, saying that no, only the immediate end of partition justifies the end of an armed campaign. But again, if you look at the support that Sinn Féin gets, certainly by 2001 when they overtake the SDLP in elections as well, it's quite clear that, the majority of the Irish Republican community plus then the wider Irish nationalist community back the peace settlement. Yeah. Exactly for the reasons you said, as a compromise. Okay, so the second question is about power sharing. Now, obviously, this was supposed to start pretty promptly after the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. It has a little jump start late 1999, and then kind of limps on up and down until 2002. And then you have it's suspended then until the St Andrews Agreement 2006, and then comes back into operation 2007. So my question there is, why do you think that's the case? Why was power sharing between 98 up to 2006-07 partly non-existent, but also so unstable in that period?
I think a big part of that was the fact that unionists hadn't embraced the Good Friday Agreement. They were still dealing with dissenters in their own ranks, and there had been a couple of high-profile resignations out of the Ulster Union's Party, Jeffrey Donaldson and Arlene Foster among them, and they then went and joined the DUP. So there was a lot of unease within unionism, and the unionist leadership hadn't taken the time to build a solid base on which to move forward. And the naysayers and the people who were negative seemed to have a lot of influence within the parties. So a bit more creativity or a bit more better and stronger leadership maybe would have meant that period between 1998 and 1999 to 2007 was more stable. But you had the Unionist Party trying to bring their party with them, a very fractured party. You had the Democratic Unionist Party outside and always, on David Trimbal's shoulder and always, I suppose, being the loudest voice in the room. And sometimes they weren't even in the room, but they were still the loudest voices. And I think if they had taken the same approach as we did, then that would have been easier. We had some really, really difficult times during that period. The Assembly would be up and then it'd be down and then it'd be up again. And certainly when I went into the executive in 2007, at that stage, as you know, we had overtaken the SDLP, the Democratic Unionist Party had overtaken the Ulster Unionist Party, and Ian Paisley Senior and Martin McGuinness were the first and Deputy First Minister in 2007. I was then the Agriculture and Rural Development Minister in that period. And that was probably the 4 most stable years we had in the 100-year history since partition. Martin McGuinness was a negotiator to his backbone. He knew what it took to bring people with him. He knew how to work people. He and Ian Paisley had a very good personal relationship. And I mean, if you think back to the firebrand of Ian Paisley in the 70s and 80s and his antics in the European Union and all of that, it was fascinating to watch that relationship. By that stage, there were 10 ministers and 2 junior ministers, so there was 12 of us around the executive table, and that was probably as big an eye-opener for me as a young Republican, being around that table and watching how Martin McGuinness handled himself and how all of us as ministers were prepared to, again, to compromise, to work with people, to find ways forward. Back to the L word, leadership. It was strong, consistent, fair and impartial leadership. Impartial in the way, obviously, as an Irish Republican, that's what you are, but you were in an executive with 4 other parties and you had to try and make things work. So when the health minister, who was an Ulster Unionist Party minister, was talking about suicide, I was saying this is as important to me as the agriculture minister as it is to the health minister, because this is an issue that we all have to get behind and we all have to work towards finding solutions for the betterment of all our people. So where you had those relationships starting to build, and I know you're going to ask me about the North-South Ministerial Council, but again, that was a conduit for building relationships too. And I think that the power sharing worked when there was that little bit of, now I'm not saying we completely trusted each other, but we were prepared to work towards trusting each other. We were prepared to work with each other. There was a can-do attitude from 2007 onwards that wasn't there from 1998.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. My own thoughts on this, why was it so unstable? I think the number one thing, and just because this coalesces with something I've looked at recently, like decommissioning and the early years of decommissioning. And I think, but in a way that I think sometimes, certainly from my own recent work, I don't think decommissioning panned out in the way that a lot of studies would suggest it did. I think that, this issue pops up after the IRA's 1994 August ceasefire. I mean, I know, again, like some scholars said, well, it was briefly mentioned beforehand, but I think there's a consensus, like in Catherine O'Donnell's book, she says this, and I think she's right. The British government never put it at the forefront of the discussions that after a ceasefire, this immediately has to be sorted. This just popped up later. And essentially what decommissioning was about, in case anyone doesn't know, is that the British government, plus the Unionist parties, but in particular Ulster Unionist Party, because they were then taking, willing to work within the executive, willing to work in the power sharing government, but for this decommissioning issue. They wanted the IRA to decommission its weapons. Now, to begin with, John Major's Conservative government, who was in power at the time, said that like the kind of, again, colloquial phrase was like guns before talks. Mm-hmm. So the idea the IRA had to give up, well, first of all, it looked like all of the weapons before the Sinn Féin were allowed to join talks or then take their role in the peace agreement and implement it. Then it was kind of, okay, John Major's government slightly went down on that and said you have to give some weapons up before talks. I think, like, where did this come from? I think because of, it's no accident that John Major's government started because of, again, the Conservative Party partly tearing itself apart over Europe. UK joins the European Union at that point, and the Maastricht Treaty, and there's a rebellion within the Conservative Party, quite a sizable minority of MPs rebelled. So the kind of majority for John Major had started to wither away. So then you start relying on the Ulster Unionist Party in Parliament. So that's their perspective on it. Unionists would also say, well, we need to see that the IRA is, serious about the peace process, so it has to give up its weapons beforehand. But if you then look on the other side for the IRA and Irish Republicans and say, well, hang on, we've not, and I would agree from my first book, they're right on this, we're not beaten, so why are we going to give up weapons before anyone else gives up weapons? And I think what's important there is to understand, psychology for Irish Republicans, those weapons are seen as defensive because of the fact that state forces, in their view, couldn't be trusted, and then Protestant loyalist paramilitaries as well, they would see in kind of cahoots with them. So that's partly, why we end up with the breakdown of the IRA ceasefire from February 96 up to July 1997. Now, I think what then happens under Tony Blair does agree with this idea from Senator Mitchell, who comes in chairing the peace process and helps to navigate through issues like decommissioning for the United States, and says we'll have, again, the phrase guns and talks. So you have the idea of discussion and decommissioning whilst the political process moves forward into the peace agreement and thereafter. But in my view, if you look at the Good Friday Agreement and what it says on decommissioning, okay, so I think lots of people focus on, it says decommissioning needs to happen within 2 years. I think it was by May 2000 or some date around there. But it also says this extra bit, which is about, but you expect what was called British demilitarization. So or they would call it normalization. So basically, we're getting British troops off the streets, and the security infrastructure, particularly linked to British Army, needs to come down. That in tandem alongside power sharing, alongside peace reform. But actually what the British government, I think particularly unionists do with the UUP, is decide, no, Sinn Féin and the IRA can go first and they can decommission first. But I think actually if you look back at what we're seeing now from National Archive documents that are coming out, plus the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement doesn't say that. It says that this is all going to be delivered as a package. And I think that's the issue. And in a sense, for Republicans on the ground, those within Sinn Féin and supporters of the IRA, but those without as well, that say, well, why are we going to, again, get rid of weapons and, take down our guard when we've got no guarantee that people are actually going to implement these parts of the agreement? So I think basically you end up getting a standoff. And then I think, what kind of, eventually we'll talk about the extra question, what leads to changes, in my view, is that because other people were willing to implement the parts that potentially they should have been moving at the same time as the IRA was willing to decommission. So I think that's the issue. And then exactly what Michelle said as well, that there's divisions within the Ulster Unionist Party. And interesting, from the National Archive documents that have come out, I sometimes think that can be in the leadership roles. I mean, David Trimble, for example, we see this in the National Archive documents that come out from British government. He was complaining a lot about the reforms that were planned under Lord Patton's review for the RUC going into the PSNI. So yeah, that's a major sticking point. But I think it's the interesting thing for me. It's more complicated than just unionism. The British government's also dragging its heels on some of these things, and that complicates the matter. And obviously for Republicans, as well for the IRA in particular, there's a split fear. If you give all your weapons over before others have actually guaranteed that they're going to implement what they're supposed to implement, you run the risk if they don't do that, people saying, right, this isn't the right course and the way forward. Yeah.
And I think you have to, it's even broader than that. So yes, you're right. People that I knew and worked with went looking for guns in the late 60s to try and protect their communities. So these guns, there was a symbolic relationship with the weapons that were procured at that stage to try and save people's lives in nationalist communities. But there was also, running parallel to all of that, there was a massive gun running operation carried out by loyalists. And you had the ship, the Clyde Valley, was coming in with thousands of weapons and ammunition. There was a shoot-to-kill policy that the British government had enacted through the 80s. So there were people actually just shot in as part of the conflict. We had some very high-profile solicitors, Pat Finucane and Rosemary Nelson, were both murdered, with British intelligence, with British guns, with people carrying out those assassinations on behalf of the state. You had a very everything. As a young Republican growing up in Tyrone, every movement that I made was documented somewhere. Those files kept going missing. The day I got my visa to go to Australia, my brother got a notification from the police to say that his file was in the hands of loyalists. So everywhere that he went, the places he socialised, the place he went to mass, his friends, all of that, dozens and dozens of photographs, photographed at checkpoint, photographed in, so there was a dossier on all of us as young Republicans that were passed on to our neighbours to try and to take us out. Sheena Campbell, who's a university student at Queen's in Belfast, was a brilliant strategist, a brilliant mind and a great woman, and she was shot dead in a bar in the university area of Belfast because of the work that she was doing for Sinn Féin. So, we had a situation that it wasn't a conflict between two similar groups. It wasn't the IRA versus the UDA or the UVF. It was the British government and their policies that brought the war to Ireland, to us. It was the likes of the shooting in Derry in 1972 and Bloody Sunday. It was the murder triangle, which was an area in Mid-Ulster where it nearly is the shape of a triangle, but there were hundreds of people, ordinary people, murdered in that area. And General Kitson, who's pretty infamous, passed away recently, but he talked about poison in the water, and that was about taking out ordinary people, ordinary civilians from the nationalist community, so that ordinary civilians from the same community wouldn't provide safe houses to the IRA, they wouldn't support the armed campaign. It was about poisoning the communities in which we grew up. So you had the British government using terrorist tactics to fight a guerrilla war. I listened this morning coming down the road to the airport to an ex-MP, a colleague of mine, Francie Malloy, talking about the inquests that have finally been given the go-ahead to happen over the shootings in Clonaux. And you had Jim Allister, an MP for the traditional unionist voice, the TUV. He's an MP in London. He gets on the airwaves on Radio Ulster this morning and says that he wished far more people, and I don't want to end up in litigation here, and so I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said that he wished far more people had been shot dead like that. These lads were in a chapel car park. They didn't have the opportunity to fire back. The first shots were fired. They were summarily executed in that chapel car park. They were taken out. They were shot dead. Some of them wounded. They could have been arrested. The British Army went in, executed these young men, all in their early 20s. Some of them were shot in the back. Some of them were shot multiple times when they were dead on the ground. And this was not a reasonable effort to try and stop, as they would call it, terrorism. So those lads were only a few years older than me. I knew them, and I knew their friends, and that's so the conflict that we grew up in wasn't just about having a wee graw for a few guns. It was about these guns were the only things that were keeping people away from us. And there were thousands and thousands of illegal weapons in the hands of loyalists. And when David Trimble was insisting on IRA decommissioning, it didn't take into consideration the fact that there were far more armed loyalists and unionists than there ever were IRA personnel. So it was a very uneven situation, and the guns we recognised, we knew that at some stage, at some point there'd be decommissioning, but the chronology of that was important too. And General de Chastelain was the person who was most involved in the decommissioning body, and Brian Keenan was one of the IRA representatives on that, and they worked for a long time. But the guns, I think the people who were involved, who were put into the decommissioning body, understood better than the British government ever did that this was not an easy thing to fix, and it couldn't happen overnight. It certainly was going to take time. It was going to take trust to be built, and for other elements of the Good Friday Agreement to be worked on in parallel. So we had given up Articles 2 and 3 as part of the Irish Constitution. Were given up as part of that. So lots of things happened straight away, but there were other things that had to happen in parallel in order to build that trust and to enable us to move forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just 2 points on that, just because we've looked at this recently. I think it's really interesting, resonates with that. One is, it's interesting, like, I think it's John Major's memoirs, and he says Loyalists were much more reasonable, willing to look at decommissioning. But the irony is when the papers have come out that I think it was David Irvine, I'm pretty sure it was David Irvine, it was definitely a Progressive Unionist Party representative, said when the British government was having these exploratory meetings with them in 95, what about decommissioning, when's this happening? They said, good governance first, build links in society, decommissioning later, that the guns won't be needed when you have that. So that's interesting. You know, Loyalists actually had a quite similar perspective on that, their leadership. The second thing, and again, it's really interesting, General de Chastelain and the, Independent International Commission on Decommissioning. What, you know, like a kind of an anecdote of this is when there was the Loyalist protest at the Holy Cross Primary School in 2001. I mean, a representative from the IICD says, we're not going to get decommissioning right now because the IRA can't allow that whilst that situation's, you know, playing out on the ground. So that's a really interesting, you know, like an anecdotal example. Exactly what you were saying.
And just on that, I mean, this was a primary school, a girls' primary school in a contested area in North Belfast. And the Loyalist community who lived nearby wanted the school closed. They wanted the children out. And they attacked these children going to school every day. Their parents were walking them to school. And there were men and women throwing balloons filled with urine at these school children, primary school, 4 to 10 or 11 years of age. And that there were, you know, those scenes were horrific. And there was a Fermanagh man involved, actually, who now has been lauded for his work in peacekeeping, a man called Father Gary Donegan, and Aidan Troy was the parish priest, Father Gary Donegan was the curate, and he's a personal friend, and I know how hard he has worked to bring about peace, but a very contested area. And, you know, so this is an area where Loyalists would want to have a Loyalist parade through what was then a nationalist area, and the demographic changes were happening all the time as well, and it was very hard for Loyalism to accept that the areas that they once controlled were shrinking because there was a dip in the population in the birth rate on the Protestant side and not so much on the Catholic side. And, you know, there was lots and lots of contested. But when you make a girls' primary school a battleground, you really don't have much of a leg to stand on, like.
Yep. Okay, so St Andrews Agreement, we'll move on to the next question and that period. So you get the St Andrews Agreement signed in 2006, power sharing commences, as you mentioned earlier, between the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, and actually lasts for essentially 10 years plus, so it's a stable period for the government. From your perspective, like looking back on that, why did the St Andrews Agreement happen? How did that come about, do you think?
I think there were still sticking points for unionism, and I think they felt that we had got everything. I think there was that perception. We didn't get everything. We were better at being pragmatic. We were better at seeing that what we had achieved, then we could, you know, work towards that. We, at that stage, the North-South Ministerial Council was sort of not really happening either. There was lots of things that we wanted to happen. Obviously then, too, the Good Friday Agreement is in 3 strands. Strand 1 is the North, Strand 2 is North-South, and Strand 3 was East-West. So, you know, I think they wanted further guarantees in terms of the governance, in terms of how we picked First and Deputy First Ministers. There were areas Martin McGuinness could see problems down the line. And the fact that the 2 roles, First and Deputy First Minister, were absolutely co-equal. But there was a perception, and certainly one that the First Ministers to that point would have enjoyed perpetuating, was that the First Minister was the first amongst equals, and that they were the top bucket, or they were the Prime Minister. And when unionism and unionist leaders held that role, they would have let the nationalists know that they were kind of subversive to them, that this was the deputy. And Ian Paisley used to call Martin McGuinness my deputy. Now, he was no more the deputy because there were 2 co-equal parts, but it was about semantics and optics and nonsense a lot of the time. Martin McGuinness had suggested at that stage that they make it co-equal, that they were just called the First Ministers. And unionism decided that they didn't like that they wanted to hold the First Minister stayed the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister stayed instead of the Deputy First Minister, they didn't realise that a point was coming, that it was going to be a Republican who was First Minister and a Unionist who was Deputy First Minister, and suddenly they didn't like it. And we had another period then of abeyance in the political institutions because unionism couldn't get their head around the fact that the First Minister was Michelle O'Neill, a young woman also from Tyrone, who was now the top bucket, and they hated that. And, you know, so Martin McGuinness had said he could see it. And I think Republicans are better at seeing the next step and the next step and the step after that. Unionism was kind of in their own wee corner or their own wee box at that stage and couldn't see beyond it. And Martin had made the offer at St Andrews, as far as I'm aware, and it was turned down. And then years later, unionism realised, oh Jesus, what have we done? Because now, instead of the co-equal First Ministers and Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little Pengelly being seen on an equal footing, they still are on an equal footing, you know, but Michelle's first and Emma's deputy, and that there was a big wobble at that stage as well. So all these things, you know, sometimes the whole thing is, it's a house of cards and it can come down at any time, you know, and you just have to keep working to keep it up and to keep it moving forward. And if we're not taking a step or two ahead all the time, then we're standing still, and that's not what Republicans want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I would say why in 2006? I think if you look at it, there's kind of 3 points I think on this. First of all, if you look at it from Sinn Féin's perspective, Irish Republicans who back Sinn Féin, I mean, there's an obvious point. You know, at that point, there's not a majority in the North for unification, so power sharing is the show in town. Having said that, I think Sinn Féin had realised that a long time before this, certainly by the 1998 peace agreement. And we can also see then, if we go back when we were talking about decommissioning, you know, that is playing a role in getting power sharing with the DUP up and going. I mean, actually then, you know, picking up from where we left off, what you get an IRA decommissioning at 2001, 2002, 2003. And then there was talks in Leeds Castle in Kent, which was quite near where we grew up. But what's interesting there is you can see in Jerry Adams, again, his memoirs and books talk about this, and Jonathan Powell, who was a chief negotiator for Tony Blair, chief of staff in Northern Ireland, essentially chief negotiator for Blair for over 10 years with the peace process. And both of them say at those talks, Sinn Féin is willing to say, you know, this is going to be complete by the IRA. The DUP needs to say it's going to go into power sharing, and there'll be the North-South Ministerial Council, etc. At that point, the DUP say, fine about the end of decommissioning, but we want the pictures. So they call it like the Kodak moment. We need the pictures of it happening. And obviously, you know, for the reasons we just talked about in the earlier question, for Irish Republicans, I mean, it looked like an attempt at like humiliation. So they're not going to accept that. So then, you know, decommissioning then finishes up in 2005. There's some controversial events, but linked to that, I think it's also because of, you know, that was the direction Republicans were heading in anyway. What I think it's stopped it happening in 2004 is the reasons we said, because of the DUP. But then there's two other things I think are really significant. One is that the British government, I don't think it's an accident after the IRA has the statement saying dump arms in 2005 and the last decommissioning act, Peter Hain, as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, comes out and said, right, British troops will be fully out of here, withdrawn to barracks by 2007. So, I mean, I can't guarantee that at the moment, that choreography of those two things, because the papers aren't out. But I suspect this is what was happening early in the peace process. When Republicans, I don't think that should have happened, because again, that's not what the peace agreement said, they're supposed to be in tandem. But when Republicans moved forward with an element of decommissioning, or in this case saying that's the end of the IRA's campaign, the British government reciprocated in some way with the demilitarisation. So that was key. Republicans have consistently asked for that since 1994. And not that, you know, suddenly overnight the British troops are off the streets and the security infrastructure down. It was just said, you know, give us a timetable. What's the timetable for these things happening? So that's key. The last thing I think that's really, really key, and you see this, Jonathan Powell's work talks about this, and then, for example, like John Tong et al.'s book on the DUP talk about this. There was a kind of a potential crisis moment for the DUP, I think, as well by 2006-07, because the Irish government plus the British government, and they say this to Sinn Féin, said, right, you've done your side of the deal to get this up and running. If the DUP continues saying, no, we're not going to go into power sharing, then we'll start suggesting, I think it was called like Plan B, which is you get the Irish government much more involved in running the governance of the North. Now, like as background again, for anyone unfamiliar, I mean, the Democratic Unionist Party, ever since, the conflict started, has opposed any Irish government, as they would say, like interference in northern affairs, because they saw it as like a British unionist affair. So this is like that, if you like, on steroids, because of this was the Irish government potentially having direct governance involved in the north. So I think that has, I think a lot, again, my own perspective is this, sometimes we're focusing too much on this gains for the DUP, the largest party, but that was something they totally opposed. So, and I think that probably was realistically what would have been on offer if they refused to go back into power sharing. Yeah, so I'd say they were quite all key factors.
Although, again, I probably feel that the Irish government were too weak, too watery, too, they didn't want to flex their muscles. The Good Friday Agreement is an agreement between two sovereign nations. And the British government were very much in the driving seat most of the time and all of the time. And the Irish government didn't step up to the mark, in my opinion. You mentioned the word humiliation, and there's plenty of examples of that. There's the sackcloth and ashes speech, when Ian Paisley felt that we needed to go through that period of repentance for our sins and for all that we've done. And there was the house trained speech. I think that was David Trimble made that remark that Republicans needed to be house trained. So it's quite insulting and derogatory language throughout a lot of this period of time. And I think we would have maybe tried to keep the train on the tracks, tried to keep the whole thing going, didn't let them provoke us, didn't react to some of that provocation, which is what it was. And as a result, I think the unionists kind of felt that they could do what they wanted and run roughshod over the rights of nationalists, because we were so wedded to the Good Friday Agreement and to power sharing structures and to moving forward that we were going to take any old nonsense. And then we had a period when Martin McGuinness, this is 8 or 9 years ago, Martin McGuinness was the first minister. Arlene Foster at that stage then, Martin was the deputy first minister to Arlene Foster's first minister. There had been a range of things that happened around that time. The Irish language was being held up, and we wanted to legislate on the Irish language, and unionists were saying basically, and I'm very conscious, I'm sitting in Cardiff talking about this, when you've got your language preserved and protected and cherished, and we wanted to do the same with ours. And so as a result, Arlene Foster just coaching horses through Irish language legislation. There were other areas of legislation that were basically not being treated seriously enough. And then they had brought in this heating package called the Renewable Heat Incentive, which basically was an incentive for people to use renewable energy. Now, that's something we would all aspire to. However, they took policy from Britain, and instead of, cut and pasting it, they tweaked it a little bit, and they made sure that the people who were, they actually fraudulently tried to take taxpayers' money and put it into the pockets, and it ended up a lot of it in the pockets of DUP supporters. So, you had this whole situation growing 10 years ago where unionists thought they could throw anything at us, we would take it, that we would just accept it because we were wedded to the process. And when Martin McGuinness said to Arlene Foster, I think, Arlene, in order to have a proper investigation into the RHI situation, you need to step aside. You need to stand down for a period of time and let us look at that and see what, because her SPAD and, her fingerprints were all over it. She was the actual environment minister when this was started up. So Arlene, whether, would have been very closely associated with it. So Martin had said, you need to stand aside and let us try and fix this. And she said no. And he said, look, Arlene, this is unacceptable. You're going to have to step down. And she said no. And he said, well, in that case, I'm resigning. I'll step you down. Again, joint office. If he stepped down, she had no choice, she couldn't stay. And that was basically, it had got to a point where we knew the Irish government weren't going to step up and do Plan B. We knew that the unions were going to mess about, try to humiliate us, try to show everybody that they were in charge and that we were second class. That's what it came down to, about being second class citizens. And when Martin resigned, and I know how much it cost him personally, and it didn't cost him anything politically. I think people understood why he did what he did. But the man was very sick as well, and he died 8 years ago this week. And he's still a massive loss to us as Republicans. But if unionists hadn't tried to be so smart of themselves and to try and continue to make us wear sackcloth and ashes, to try and humiliate Republicans and to provoke them and all the rest of it, then, and that's what I'm talking about the lack of leadership. And Arlene Foster in particular showed an inordinate lack of leadership. This is somebody who prides herself on being very bright and all the rest of it, but she hadn't a notion when it came to how to deal with people. And she and I had very similar upbringings. We were both in the same constituency and from South Tyrone as MLAs. We were in the executive together, we're the same age, and my mind boggled at the lack of leadership and the lack of common sense that woman had when it came to trying to navigate a very difficult and tenuous situation. So, thankfully, we got it back up again before COVID, and we got things moving, but it's never, that threat is never that far away that people will go, I don't like it anymore, I'm walking away, throwing the dummy out of the pram or whatever. And I feel there's lots of times when I feel like the Dublin government could have stepped up a lot more and didn't, and with some notable exceptions. And to be honest with you, a lot of the influence came from Washington. And Bill and Hillary Clinton were very instrumental in that. But people like, oh, now this is the menopause, my head's fried for names. But we had some very powerful friends and allies in both the House of Representatives and the House of Congress. And we worked with, and it was people in the United States who put pressure on the British government and, you know, who were instrumental in keeping the show on the road as well. Not just George Mitchell, there were others as well. And, you know, we can't forget that there was a very special relationship between Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, John Major and Albert Reynolds before that. And John Major probably doesn't get an awful lot of credit. Tony Blair did. John Major did what he could in the circumstances that he had. So, you know, there were lots of figures involved in helping to keep the whole thing together. And 25 years on, 26 years on, we should now be in a situation where the North-South Ministerial Council has expanded, where, you know, there are other areas of cooperation, and I know you want to ask me about them, so I'm not going to elaborate now. But there have been so many stop-starts. The vision that we had, the hope we had in 1998 for how the Good Friday Agreement was going to grow and organically bring people with it, and, you know, you had all the provisions within it around policing and language and decommissioning and all the rest of it, but you also had the pragmatism built into it that allowed it to naturally broaden out, and certainly Strand 2 had the ability to do that, and it has been stymied for the past 2.5 decades.
Great. Yeah, that's interesting. As you said, that'll be interesting just building on that with a couple of questions time as well. Just going on to some of the things we talked about then. So we get to Brexit, we have the further collapses, you know, up to 2020, and then there's another one in 2021, I think, up to 2024. So, I mean, you've touched on that, but is there any, do you think like Brexit played a role in that, the Stormont coming up and down in that period of collapses? Or?
It probably did, because, you know, again, unionists were campaigning and arguing for as hard a Brexit as we could have. I grew up near Knocknacloy, and I went to school in Caledon. This is all on the Tyrone, kind of Monaghan-Armagh border. And one of the most heavily militarised bases in Europe was in Knocknacloy. a young fella who played football with my brothers in Ahalou GFC, Aidan McInnesby, was shot dead going to a match on a Sunday afternoon, crossing that checkpoint. We couldn't go, we couldn't drive through the village to the football field, which was out the other side of the checkpoint. We had to park at the side and walk through, because if you took your car through, you were guaranteed to have missed the match, because you'd have been searched for about 4 hours. And you know, so it was horrendous growing up on the border, horrendous. And, you know, we had roads closed and we had roads blown up by the British Army, and we had, you know, they just tried to make it impossible for people to cross the border. And you had communities, people who were, you know, people in Knocknacloy who had friends and family in Emmy Vale and who couldn't go the 4 or 5 miles. You know, there were, basically the British government, the British tried to just make the border impassable. And it's impossible to do that, and we were very creative at finding ways around it. And, you know, going through fields and things like that to avoid checkpoints and all that, that's what you had to do. Because if you were going to a disco and you were going to be held up for 4 hours, you know, there was no point in going out at that stage to land to the Hillgrove or to the Four Seasons for a Kurt and realise that all the lads were gone because you were getting in at 1:30 in the morning. So yeah, we knew that Brexit could be an absolute disaster for the people that we represent and our communities and our friends and families. And the DUP were arguing for the strongest possible Brexit, because they had a vision that this border would suddenly become again impenetrable, and that, you know, we would remain, the 26 counties would remain within the EU. We would be part of the new outside third country status that Britain had, and that there would be no trade, there would be no movement across the border, that it would be effectively closed down. And that's what they were hoping for, the Berlin Wall along 300 miles of rural roads. And we were very incompatible on that one. We were never going to have a meeting of minds on how we saw Brexit panning out. And again, it was international influence and it was international friends. And Martina Anderson, our MEP at the time, was in Europe lobbying and campaigning and trying to let her colleagues in the European Parliament understand what Brexit would mean on the island of Ireland. And, you know, we had to work really, really hard to protect the island of Ireland from the ravages of Brexit. And like, we're very grateful for the people who helped us do that.
Okay, yeah, and, you know, certainly I think when it, you know, power sharing up and down in that period with Brexit, I think I would agree pretty much with what you said, and there's kind of two reasons things going on. Is the DUP, that would be my reading of it, wanting a hard Brexit, and just partly because of, on the one hand, you know, like in the media, I remember at the time the DUP said, oh, we don't want a border back up. But then I remember, you know, just from studying that, I thought, well, there has to be a border because the EU's not going to allow products in and out just with an open border. It can't allow that. So although they weren't saying that, but, and it's interesting you said that, because I do think, oh, they clearly do want a hard border because that's the reality of that, you know, what they're trying to sell. I think like on their part, and the way I kind of understood it in my head was, you know, looking at the DUP's history, and I think the fact that, I mean, they don't want, you know, Irish government influence in the north for reasons about linked to why they want partition in the first place. But the EU, in that sense, they saw, and its precursor, like the European, what's it called, EEC, so European Economic Community. And now in the 80s, you had speeches. I remember this one that people bring up in researchers there. It's not my particular area about EU and the North. But I do remember there's the quote from Ian Paisley, and he says, you know, there's X number of Roman Catholics in the EU compared to Protestants. And I think that might have some influence. I think for the DUP members who don't think exactly in that way, it was more that, you know, the European Union's a chance to dilute borders, and dilution of borders is bad if you want Northern Ireland to be seen as, you know, within the UK. I think the other two things that went along with this, you know, why did they see Brexit like an opportunity? Demographics, as we've seen in the last couple of years in the North, certainly in the Unionist side, they're going down. Yeah. And I think that it was an opportunity to, try and find a way to buck that trend. It might not actually change demographics, but exactly what you said is make the two parts all so incompatible. You have a different economic system, different trading rules, etc. And I think also, I remember thinking back to Belfast City Hall, and there were the flag protests, you know, in the early 2010s. And they come up with this argument, so explaining that for people, that the SDLP, Sinn Féin with the Alliance, put through an act in Belfast City Council saying that the Union Jack can't fly 365 days a year, 7 days a week here because of the fact that it's a shared city.
Yeah.
So it'd be the same as it is in the UK, like on Armed Forces Day, the monarch's birthday, etc. And the DUP were ferociously against it, and members of their community would have been as well. And I remember at the time they would say, this is like an Irish Republican war against Britishness. So the way I looked at Brexit, I think they saw this exactly as an opportunity to buck these trends and stop it. What provided that opportunity for them, because actually, as we know, the North voted, what was it, 55%, a little bit, point something to remain. What provided that opportunity was the fact that you then had the British government, particularly under Theresa May, has to rely on them for a competent supply deal, although she chose to rely on them. There were other options, but she chose to do that, to try and placate, certainly in England, the Brexit majority. And England, I say specifically because I know Wales did vote Remain, but leave, in the referendum in 2016. But for England, that's where, certainly for your Westminster parties like British Conservatives and Labour, that's where they're going to win the majority. So I think in that respect, that's why May went for the kind of hard Brexit and then coaxed the DUP to join in with that. If you look at it from the DUP's perspective, for exactly the things you've been talking about, like the relationship and building in the North, they think, well, this is great because we have a kind of lever on power in Westminster, and we don't have to share power with people back home that we ultimately don't agree with their constitutional objectives. So I think that's why partly that situation was, was particularly bad for the island of Ireland, North and South.
Absolutely.
Because it put the DUP in the driving seat in Westminster. But it backfired, and we see it works in two ways. For the Conservatives, when Boris Johnson then comes in after May, and you saw this in polls, like in YouGov polls, that were, and I can't remember exact figures, but a majority of Conservative members, these are only Conservative members who were polled, said, yeah, just ditch Northern Ireland, that's fine, and we'll just have a hard Brexit deal. And so, in fairness to Boris Johnson, he looks at that and thinks, okay, fine, that's the path to power for 2019, so that's what I'll do. And then the problem is for the DUP, then you ditched. And then I think that's partly why they come back to the table in 2020 and power sharing comes back. Partly their votes going down as well, so that they're getting a message. And then once you get this Windsor framework deal and they don't like that emerged in 2021, again, they kind of, I think, collapsed power sharing, got outside of that to see if it would put pressure on the EU and British government. But what's interesting in this, Jonathan Powell's book says, in his view, Sinn Féin and the DUP are both very good at negotiating. That's why I think the DUP overplayed their hand there, because this was well beyond the island of Ireland. This was the EU as an entire trading bloc with the British government.
Absolutely.
And if they've made their deal, there's no way they're just going to say, actually, do you know what? We'll take this, what's in all but named special status for the North within the EU, and we'll just placate the DUP. They didn't do that. So I think essentially my own personal view is they come back to the table for 2024.
I think so.
Because where else are they going to go? And they had to make a decision at that point because they'd started to hemorrhage some votes. A minority of their vote is going away for kind of liberal unionism that's gone to the Alliance Party. So I think, it's quite a long-winded answer, but that's my sense of why we ended up in that situation. And it's, for them, electorally, it's harmed them by going down that route.
Yeah. And then since Brexit, the unionism in the past 3 or 4 elections have been in the minority. Mm-hmm. The 6 counties was set up. At the time, when you talk about Ulster is 9 counties. Ulster is one of the 4 provinces of Ireland. Ulster itself is 9 counties, but when Ireland was partitioned in the 1920s, unionists in Belfast didn't want the 9 counties because it would be too equal of a society. The Catholic-Protestant ratio would be similar. So they ditched Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan and decided they only wanted the 6 counties because that would be more manageable and that their inbuilt majority would be protected. And that's gone, and symbolically, that's a big thing for unionism as well. So the First Minister is now a nationalist and a Republican. Unionism has been relegated to, as they see it now, they'll never see themselves as second-class citizens. They've got a unique view of the world in that way. But, symbolically, that was a bit of a shock for them too. Then you've also got a new generation of young unionists who don't have the same baggage that their parents did, who are very relaxed about being European, and the fact that, we've got the offer if when unity happens, we are automatically back into the European Union. And a lot of young Protestants feel that that's where we should be. So, the demographics is working against them from that point of view as well, because when you look at the figures for unity in various different polls, it's the older generation who are more against it, and it's the young people that are absolutely in favour of it and want it to happen. So, but we have to keep working towards a situation where Ireland is a better place to live. We have a very stark imbalance right now with life expectancy. So if you're born and raised in the north, you can expect to live roughly 2 years less than somebody who's born and raised in the south, who's raised 20 miles down the road, because of things like infant mortality is one of them, but standards of living is another, education attainment is another. Poverty is a very real thing, and we have people are living longer in the south than they are in the north, and young unionists are going to recognise that and go, well, why should my children suffer in East Belfast when their cousins in Kildare are going to be so much better off?
Yeah. Okay, question 5 is, in the next decade, where do you see the North of Ireland's political future heading, in your view?
It's a very exciting decade. It's an exciting decade to be involved in politics. I see it as, I actually think that we missed the boat last year when we didn't win the general election in the south. And I think it's going to take a Sinn Féin Taoiseach to actually really make this happen. It's very interesting, since leaving his post as Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar has become a lot more vocal about the importance and the benefits of unity. I think the Fianna Fáil is probably as big an obstacle to unity right now as any other unionist party. And you know, I think there's a fear there that if Sinn Féin get into government, that will be hard to shift out of it. So we didn't win the last election, and Mary Lou MacDonald is the leader of the opposition in the south. But I think it's going to take a Sinn Féin Taoiseach to really get the dynamic for it. We need to be planning for unity, we need to be preparing for it, we need to be working towards it, we need to be bringing people with us. We need to ensure that that north-south divide that Britain's famous for isn't a feature of life in Ireland afterwards. So we need to be measuring. There hasn't been a lot of statistical research into all those things that I mentioned. The infant mortality one's a fairly easy one, but the standard of living one is a lot more difficult. So you need to measure the things that you value, and we need to try and find a way. And we'll use those figures then to help bring people with us, because we're not going to, nobody's imposing Irish unity on anybody. Our job as Republicans is to try and convince people that that would be better off. They'd be better off in a united Ireland. Their children would be better off, and their grandchildren would certainly be better off. So we have to bring people with us, work with our unionist counterparts, and ensure that they know that they would still, their Britishness is still going to be protected, and they'll still be able to maintain that British identity that they have and hold dear, but that the people on the island of Ireland within the EU are able to reach their full potential. Because at the minute, partition has failed every man, woman and child on the island of Ireland. Brexit is currently affecting every man, woman and child on the island of Ireland, even with the measures that we have to protect us. Brexit's been a disaster, partition's been a disaster. We need to work towards the next 10 years is going to be fundamental in shaping the next century. And I think that there will be a border poll, but we need to be ready for winning it. And there will be a white paper on Irish unity, but it might take, like I say, a Sinn Féin-led government to make that happen. And at the end of the day, we are wasting opportunities. I'm the mother of 3, the grandmother of 2, and we're wasting opportunities for them children because partition has failed us all. And we struggled through, 13, 14 years of Tory austerity. Look what Labour have done under Keir Starmer. Honest to God, we're just shaking our heads in despair at what's happening on this island. We can do things so much better ourselves.
Great. Question 6, and this is a different tangent, is about your time as an MP. And you've been an MP like various occasions you were elected with Sinn Féin. Can we talk about that and like abstentionism? And what I'm interested in this is just particularly you get it in Irish media, you get it in the UK media as well, that every time there's the Westminster election, this is portrayed like really negatively, and it's going to cost Sinn Féin. And yet, consistently from 2001, it doesn't cost Sinn Féin, and we see they finish ahead of the SDLP. And even before that period, during the conflict, there were Sinn Féin abstentionist MPs. Adams was elected from 1983, I think, onwards. And the interesting thing, obviously, more recently is, and in the conflict as well, the SDLP take their seats. So there is a clear contrast. And yet, even in the years when, Stormont was down, the SDLP, interestingly, when I was looking for their manifestos, and this because I've done a bit of work on it, they say, don't vote for Sinn Féin because there's no point because they don't take the seats. And that obviously doesn't resonate. So my two questions are with that. We'll do one question first, actually, which is, what's Sinn Féin's perspective on abstentionism in Westminster, if you're explaining that and why it seems effective?
Okay, so I was first elected in 2001 to Westminster in Fermanagh South Tyrone. At that stage, we had two MPs, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams. Then we two became four, when myself and Pat Doherty became MPs as well. So I then was an MP consistently. I've won Westminster elections. My first majority was 53 votes. In a very contested election, and Fermanagh South Tyrone had been held by a unionist for 18 years, and before that it had been held by a number of nationalist kind of agreed candidates. But Bobby Sands had won the seat when he was on hunger strike in 1981, which was fundamental to my life and to my feelings and thoughts on all of this. So Bobby Sands' seat, 20 years later, I won it by 53 votes. The next election, both the DUP and UUP ran a candidate, and that was my biggest majority. It was around 2,000 votes. Then, every year since, the DUP and the UUP would come together to put a single candidate. And I won in 2010 by 4 votes. And when it went to court, I've had 2 electoral courts. When it went to the electoral court, the judge reduced it to 1 vote. But he said 1 vote's a majority. So whoever is watching, whatever time you're watching this at, never, ever, ever waste your vote, because it's really important. Everybody should be voting. So won a Westminster seat by 1 vote, lost it in 2015, and 2 years later, Theresa May called her strong and stable election, and I'm back in my Westminster seat again. So it's been very interesting. But throughout all of this, abstentionism gets talked about, and we knew in Brexit that was probably the biggest pressure point, because British people were saying to us, they were stopping me on the street in London and saying, Michelle, would you not go in and save us from Brexit? You have the power to do this. And we were going, no, there's only 7 of us. We can't stop Brexit. Plus, whatever is the will of the British people in terms of the British people's constitutional future, that's your business. We don't think British influences should have any role in our constitutional future, so therefore why would we get involved in yours? So that's about, so it'd be hypocritical of us to stay out of Westminster because as an abstentionist, we don't take our seats in Westminster because that's British Parliament. We take our seats in the Assembly, we take our seats in the Dáil, we are fully committed. But we don't take our seats. That doesn't mean we don't work as MPs. We were very active as MPs. We did our constituency work like everybody else. We were back and forward to London all the time. We worked with other MPs. We couldn't get involved in the legislative side of things, but we were very active in terms of speaking and advocating on behalf of people in the North on all sorts of areas, mental health, economics, special educational needs. We worked on I remember speaking at an event in London. My husband had taken a stroke and I spoke at a stroke association event in the House of Commons. And, so we were still there making our point. And a lot of what MPs do is lobbying and advocating and all of the rest of it. So we did all of that. And I loved working in London and, loved the fact, but we would be sitting talking to colleagues in the SNP and in Plaid Cymru, and we'd be saying, what's the point of being here? Do you see in the Brexit debate, there were 7 Sinn Féin MPs and people were asking us, go and save us from Brexit, but there were, at that stage, there were 60 or 70 SNP MPs, and they couldn't get it stopped either. So Westminster, given the dynamic of Westminster, there's over 600 seats, nationalists are always going to be in a minority. Scotland, Wales, the north of Ireland are always going to be in a minority because the numbers in England are just massive, and we're never really going to make a big impact in Westminster. So we can make as big an impact without taking our seats. And we'd be slagging friends of ours in the SNP and going, you need to be abstentionist, you're not. And they were going, our constituents are saying that to us. But, so that was interesting too. And so abstentionism doesn't work for any of the regions, if you like. And equally, even in England, Westminster's failed the north of England. It's failed Cornwall and places like that. There's lots of inequality still in England, never mind in Scotland, Wales and the north of Ireland. So yeah, we're not wedded to Westminster today, David. We want to send people to it. We want to represent our constituents, but at the end of the day, you don't need to sit in the green benches to do that.
Great. Yep. And just a couple of thoughts from this, from me. I'm actually doing a bit of work at the moment. It looks about Sinn Féin abstentionism, and it looks at a bill to my colleague does about the Basque country and the different bill. These the modern manifestation, but it was bad as sooner and other before. And sometimes they'd sit in Madrid, and other times they haven't sat in Madrid. So it's interesting the dynamics. But certainly from what, and exactly a lot of this is just resonating with what you say, that like long-term, short-term reasons, I think, and the long-term reasons is it's tradition for Irish Republicans since 1918's general election that essentially led to the South eventually getting independence. By getting a majority, and then the British government prorogued it, and you get the what some would call like the Town War, the Irish War of Independence.
Can I just say that, Thomas, the first woman elected to the House of Commons was a Sinn Féin woman, Countess Constance Markievicz. She was the first woman elected to the British House of Commons. They tried to airbrush her out of history, and it was Nancy Astor who got the credit for being the first woman MP. Constance Markievicz was the first woman MP, first Sinn Féin woman MP. I was the second Sinn Féin woman MP to be elected. It took too long to get another one, but I'm very proud of the fact that that's a tradition we came from. And when she got the letter from the House of Commons to say that she'd been successful and she'd won her seat, they referred to her as Mr. Markievicz because they'd never had a Mrs. in the House of Commons. And she was in a British prison. I think she was in prison in the Isle of Wight when she got the letter to say that she had successfully contested and won the seat. So that's just a wee bit of history. If that comes up in a quiz sometime, you'll have me to thank for that.
That's the credit for it. But I think that's really important, and I think that two things like long term as a protest against British rule and the British jurisdiction over any part of Ireland at that point in 1918. And I think linked to that, and you mentioned yourself, it's actually been successful. It was successful then in 1918 and helped, alongside the IRA's armed campaign back then, but it was important, the political dynamic to that as well. And obviously in the 1981, the hunger strikes elections, and then Owen Caron, I think, won the seat after, and then Jerry Adams won the seat in abstention. So there was success with it. And I think it's, a continuing protest as Republicans would see against, British undemocratic rule and partition of the north of Ireland. And it's interesting, like John Tong and Murray's book on the SDLP Sinn Féin say as well, that it's different, for Sinn Féin saying, well, the institutions, when there used to be abstention to Dáil Éireann, and then that's dropped, and obviously Stormont, that's dropped. But the difference there is this argument that they are still Irish institutions run by Irish politicians, whereas it comes back to that point you said in Westminster, the numbers game is historically long-term and short-term as well, has been important factors. And also another key point, I think, when I was looking at this situation in the Basque country is Irish nationalists don't need to sit in Westminster to get self-determination because that's already written in the Downing Street Declaration, the Good Friday Agreement. So, you're not going to affect the decision whether Ireland gets self-determination there. You might get an influence when the SDLP would say when that vote's held. Sure, but the principle's been conceded. That's totally different to the Basque country and the Spanish situation. And I think short-term as well is... there's various powers that are devolved to the north. So there's debate here in Wales and Scotland on that as well for their MPs about what things they can influence, what they can't. And I think as well, it works. They've continually, Sinn Féin beat the SDLP since 2001. And now, since 2024, is the largest party in the north of Ireland in elections. So doesn't seem any pressing need to discuss changing it. And the second thing, and that's interesting because certainly your own manifestos were talking about that around the Brexit period, particularly in 2017's election, and 2019, the SNP had a lot of MPs for Scotland. I mean, at one point, I think they only had 3 that weren't their MPs. And yeah, they weren't able to stop Brexit. And actually, Scotland had the largest pro-EU vote in the Brexit referendum, and that was ignored. So yeah, I think short and long-term factors, and certainly, yeah, from what we're saying today, and there's always this discussion every time we have a Westminster election, but I don't see that changing for the reasons we said.
And for the record, we have 7 Sinn Féin MPs, the SDLP have 2. And we've consistently outperformed them for years and years and years. So, you know, we don't see that situation changing anytime soon either.
Yep. Okay, so one last question on that actually I was going to mention, because you mentioned like the work of a Sinn Féin MP.
Yeah.
And just because, why was I doing this?
Implementation.
Yeah, of the Good Friday Agreement Committee. So yeah, maybe there's a bit there to talk about. You've already mentioned like speaking at events, and then maybe there's bits of work in Dublin as well, and yeah.
Absolutely, and that's, so the implementation on the Good Friday Agreement, no, I'm not giving it its proper title, but basically this is a committee in Dublin, which is made up of TDs, senators and MPs right across the island of Ireland, who are invited to help to look at how the Good Friday Agreement has been implemented, where the gaps are, and all of that. So depends sometimes on the chair and all of that where that work goes, but that's a really good committee, and we've done meetings in the past. Now, Unionist MPs generally don't come to those meetings. They're invited. They have a seat at the table, the same as Sinn Féin and SDLP, but they don't take up their invitation. However, they have engaged with that committee a number of times. If we're meeting, for example, the Northern Ireland Select Affairs Committee, the Unionist MPs on that will meet as part of the Select Affairs Committee, and will meet the Good Friday Agreement Committee. So, and you know what? There's so much important work that affects us all on the island of Ireland. So there's a big, massive rail review has been carried out over the past couple of years. It has made recommendations, and as a result of those recommendations, 31 counties are going to get access to rail, and 1 county in all of Ireland is going to miss out, and that's Fermanagh, which is one of the counties that I represented. So, you know, there is an issue. There's a road that leads from Dublin to Donegal that goes up through my constituency, again through Tyrone, called the A5. We've had a horrific number of deaths on that road. This is a piece of work that we can be working on the island of Ireland. We have the whole issue of climate change. We have the issue of, you know, the whole issue of neutrality is a very real and very live one at the minute. And obviously Sinn Féin's position is that we are not in favour of scrapping our neutrality position. But there are things that happen in Dublin, decisions that are made that we want to influence as well. So we have Sinn Féin TDs, Chuck Dadala, members of the House in Dublin. We have senators as well, but we also use our MPs to help to lobby, to advocate, to work with our colleagues on the rest of the island of Ireland to make life better for our constituents too. So that's what politics is about. It's about working with people, maybe not always that you agree with, but that you have a common interest or there's a common bond. And if you're going to save lives on the A5, that road has to be upgraded. The Dublin government are currently working on, and it's maybe worth your students looking at, the Shared Island Unit has been set up, and it's a useful piece of work, and there's money has come up to infrastructure projects like the Ulster Canal, like the Narrow Bridge, which is a bridge which is linking across from Omeath and Warren Point, Omeath and Carlingford across to Warren Point. So the Irish government have a lot more money than the British government currently, and they are willing to invest in infrastructure projects on the island of Ireland. And that's all very useful and helpful towards us, but we really want to see more beef on the bones of what the Irish government are doing. And again, the Good Friday Agreement Committee is a useful vehicle for making that happen.
And the last question, which is partly, I think, touching on some of the themes we've already looked at, I'll combine the two because I think they're linked, which is about the North-South Ministerial Council. So what's your view on like how well that's worked since 1998, but also is there anything you think should be changed about it or adapted to try and make it more effective?
Absolutely. I think the North-South Ministerial Council's work has been stymied over the 2.5 decades by the both by the Ulster Unionist Party and by the Democratic Unionist Party. In St Andrews, it was changed. So you had the ministers. So, for example, I, as Agriculture Minister, would have had a North-South Ministerial Council meeting with my counterpart in Dublin, and the two Agriculture Ministers on the island of Ireland would have worked together. There'd have been a number of recommendations coming to that. We'd have had, memorandum of understanding, or, so we'd have made decisions and agreed those decisions at North-South Ministerial Council level. A lot of the groundwork was done by civil servants north and south beforehand, so it meant that people were travelling from Belfast to Dublin and vice versa, and they were working, and we've been able to get lots of things done, but we could have done so much more. So I envisaged that the North-South Ministerial Council would, we'd set up a new one on climate change, or we'd set a new one up on renewable energy, or we would have a North-South Ministerial Council on All Ireland Rail, not just an infrastructure one, but on broader. So there are hundreds of themes whereby we would benefit, and people on the entire island of Ireland would benefit from broadening out the North-South Ministerial Council remit. That hasn't happened. Budgets have been stymied as well, and there's just the cold dead hand of unionism on the North-South Ministerial Council, and there's scope there for that to do so much more. And it's in their interests, to work to make life better for their constituents too. So I'm very much, I was saying, after Good Friday, after the St Andrews Agreement, we then had a situation where the Northern Minister, rather than me as an Agriculture Minister speaking to my agricultural counterpart, there would be an accompanying minister, which was a minister from the unionist side who would be the third person in that dynamic, and that they would there'd be checks and balances. So that was grand. I didn't mind having the accompanying minister working with me, and they got the agenda and all the rest of it, and they'd try, and there was some really silly things happened back in the time about changing the all-island animal health policy to the Northern Ireland / Republic of Ireland animal health and welfare policy. Try saying that with a few drinks in your neck, so there was all stupid stuff. But one of the things was, I was the accompanying minister then to the health North-South NSMC meetings, and those were fascinating, because I was able to see then, as the Agriculture Minister, the amount of work that was going on health on the island of Ireland. And the island of Ireland is too small. We don't have the capacity to do paediatric cardiac services north and south. That's a service, an essential service for parents and children, and it can only happen on an all-Ireland basis. So there were loads of things that we could do to actually make life, enhance our livelihoods, our lives, our life expectancy by working under the NSMC. So I think it is an untapped potential that would need to be fixed. And I think as well, and I'm conscious to a time, Thomas, but there's lots of things that I think we need to deliver on. Casement Park, absolute thunder and disgrace. Casement Park hasn't been built, and it's unionists that are holding that up, who don't want a stadium in the north of Ireland that is bigger than the rugby or the soccer stadium. But it was supposed to be a single stadium, and soccer particularly didn't want it because they couldn't fill it, and because the GA pitch is much bigger than the soccer pitch. So there's all sorts of nonsense went on about the so-called national stadium. The compromise was 3 codes. Soccer's been built, rugby's been built, Gaelic still hasn't been built, and that's down to unionist intransigence, lack of leadership, lack of vision. Well, lack of lots of things, but I probably can't say in this forum.
Fine. Super. Thanks very much, Michelle, for coming and chatting to us in Cardiff. And it's been really interesting insights, taking you for a broad sweep of time as well over the last an hour plus. So it's been really good. So I just want to finish saying Jock and Bell. Many thanks to everyone for watching this episode. And again, this is Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network video. We've got various other events, and it's funded by the GW4. And again, Jock and Bell, many thanks for the GW4 for sponsoring this. So yeah, thanks very much, Michelle.
Thank you.
See everyone again. Thank you.
Thanks.